Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. Today, the center of gravity is China, tightening pressure across multiple layers at once. Trade leverage, regional military signaling, tech infrastructure control, and diplomatic positioning are all moving in the same direction. And what makes it interesting is how coordinated it feels across completely different theaters. Start in Northeast Asia, because that's where the most immediate friction is building with Japan. Beijing has expanded export controls and watchlist restrictions, targeting a wide range of Japanese entities tied to defense, advanced manufacturing, and research. We're talking about parts of Mitsubishi's defense ecosystem, Komatsu-linked units, and Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, among others. The controlled items matter just as much as the targets: rare earth elements, machine tools, batteries, and semiconductor-related production inputs. This is not just a trade adjustment. It is a structural pressure point being applied to Japan's defense industrial base at a moment when Tokyo is openly recalibrating its regional security posture around Taiwan contingencies. And that linkage is the key. China is clearly tying economic access to strategic alignment on Taiwan. The message is pretty consistent. Strategic signaling has economic consequences now, not later. At the same time, Beijing is layering in non-economic pressure. We're seeing continued detention of Japanese nationals in China, tighter scrutiny on exchanges, and lingering restrictions on certain imports. It's not a single tool. It's a system of friction applied across multiple entry points. Zoom out from Japan, and the diplomatic layer gets more fluid, especially toward Europe. China's foreign minister is preparing a multi-country visit to Nordic states, including Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway. On paper, this is standard diplomacy. In practice, it's part of a broader effort to keep European-China policy from hardening into a unified front. At the same time, EU-China trade tensions are still sitting just below the surface. European officials are pushing for measurable progress on trade imbalance, intellectual property, and market access issues, with a loose deadline for results later in the year. The core frustration in Brussels is still the same. European market exposure to Chinese exports keeps expanding, while reciprocal access remains limited. So you've got China working both sides of the continent: pressure in Asia, engagement in Europe. Different tones, same strategic objective of keeping flexibility in the system. Now shift into the global economic layer, because here China is trying to frame itself as something closer to the stabilizer in a volatile environment. The disruption around the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Iran conflict has created energy price shocks across multiple economies. Fertilizer costs, chemical inputs, shipping volatility. The ripple effects are widespread. But China's position is different. Because of its energy mix, reserve strategy, and state-directed industrial system, it has largely avoided the sharp inflation spikes seen elsewhere. And that allows Beijing to present itself as the more predictable manufacturing hub in a period where others are dealing with cost shocks. That narrative is reinforced by the latest manufacturing data. China's factory activity has moved back into expansion territory, and the driver is very specific: AI-linked global demand. Semiconductors, servers, advanced electronics, data infrastructure components. Export orders tied to that ecosystem are what is pulling the sector forward. But underneath that, the domestic picture is still soft. Internal consumption remains weak, property sector drag continues, and pricing power inside parts of manufacturing is still under pressure. So what you get is a split economy: externally strong in high-tech exports, internally uneven and still searching for stable demand. That split matters because it shapes how much leverage Beijing can project versus how much internal balancing it still has to manage. Now bring in a second major shift that is quietly expanding: critical infrastructure security. The United States and parts of Europe are now moving toward tighter scrutiny of Chinese-made power grid components, especially solar inverters and battery-connected systems. These are the devices that actually connect renewable energy installations to national electricity grids. The concern is not abstract. It's about whether remote vulnerabilities or embedded systems could create disruption pathways in critical infrastructure. China is a dominant global producer in this space, which is exactly why it has become a focal point. What used to be a commercial supply chain conversation is now being reframed as a national security issue tied directly to grid resilience. This is one of those areas where the China competition is quietly shifting from digital networks into physical infrastructure. Now move to Taiwan, where the pressure environment is steady rather than explosive, but persistent. Taiwan's leadership is increasingly focused on espionage and infiltration as core security concerns, especially within military structures. Recent messaging from President Lai Ching-te to military cadets emphasized exactly that point. Infiltration, intelligence collection, and influence operations are now considered active components of the threat environment. At the same time, PLA activity around the island continues at a steady tempo. Aircraft sorties, naval presence, and government vessels operating in proximity to Taiwan's monitored zones. Nothing in this set suggests escalation to crisis levels, but it does reinforce a consistent operational pattern. Pressure maintained through repetition rather than spikes. And that same pattern shows up in the South China Sea. China continues patrol activity around Scarborough Shoal, a contested maritime feature also claimed by the Philippines. These patrols coincided with U.S. and Philippine maritime exercises in nearby waters. Chinese naval and Coast Guard units shadowed Allied activity, reinforcing presence and signaling jurisdictional claims. This is classic gray zone behavior. No direct confrontation, but continuous assertion of operational visibility and control. Think of it less as a single event and more like a constant overlay on Allied operations in the region. Now add in a broader military signaling layer between China and Russia. The two countries conducted a joint long-range air patrol involving strategic bombers, fighters, aerial refueling aircraft, and airborne early warning systems. Russian Tu-95 bombers operated alongside Chinese H-6K platforms, supported by escort fighters and electronic warfare elements. The significance is not just coordination, but complexity. Refueling plus command and control plus electronic support creates a full mission package that resembles sustained long-range strike capability rather than symbolic presence flights. It's also happening across multiple Indo-Pacific air corridors, which adds to the signaling effect aimed at regional observers. Shift into the intelligence and information domain, because this is becoming increasingly central to how Beijing frames security risk. China's Ministry of State Security issued warnings about augmented reality applications collecting highly precise geospatial data. The concern is that billions of environmental scans generated through consumer apps can be aggregated into high-resolution spatial models. Those models, in the wrong hands, could have intelligence or military applications. What's notable here is the framing. Everyday digital interaction is now being treated as a potential intelligence input stream. That reflects a broader shift in how data is conceptualized inside China's security system. On the external information side, a major legal case in the United States concluded with a lengthy prison sentence for Chinese businessman Guo Wengui, also known as Miles Guo. The case involved fraud, racketeering, and large-scale fundraising networks tied to political and financial activity within diaspora communities. It sits at the intersection of influence, money flows, and political activism targeting China. Finally, Hong Kong remains a steady example of institutionalized internal security enforcement. Official reporting continues to show hundreds of arrests and convictions under national security legislation since its implementation. The system has expanded through additional legal frameworks and updated enforcement mechanisms, reinforcing long-term structural control over political activity inside the territory. Thanks for listening. If this episode was useful, take a second to leave a review or drop a comment. It makes a real difference in getting this in front of the right audience. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com, with deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Have a great day.